From the campus of Stanford University.
People are worried about data. They're worried about their privacy and their security. They should be. We need secure systems.
This is the future of everything.
But we can't have a system that closes that data off. It is too rich of a source of inspiration, innovation, and discovery for new things in medicine.
With your host, Russ Altman.
Today on The Future of Everything, the future of philanthropy. So the internet is the source of all knowledge, and it defines philanthropy as the desire to promote the welfare of others, expressed especially by the generous donation of money to good causes. That was the first hit on my Google search at 6 a.m. this morning. Of course, we all make philanthropic decisions constantly. Do I give money to the panhandler on the street who's asking for money with a cardboard sign? What charities do I want to support, especially on the last day of December when I might be thinking about my tax bill for that year that is about to end? If you have more means, more money, you can think seriously about major gifts in many categories. You can give to educational organizations, human aid and health organizations, non-governmental organizations, the arts, or any other activity or institution that you feel merits your support. And this is a culture that comes and goes and is as stronger and less strong over time, but is always there. There are, of course, examples historically of major philanthropic efforts. In the 20th century, you think of names like the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, dare I say Leland Stanford, who started Stanford University, where we are right now, and who was a train guy. He built railroads, and that's where his fortune came from. More recently, Howard Hughes from the aircraft industry has created huge funding resources for biomedical research. The Gates Foundation from Bill and Melinda Gates has looked at particularly at diseases that affect the developing world in Africa, malaria, tuberculosis, HIV. And very recently, Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg have created the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative with very broad goals in education, in policy, and in biomedical research. And there are many, many others. I apologize if I have left out your favorite philanthropy. But what are the dynamics of philanthropies? Does and should society depend on these as a key part of the plan, and I'm using scare quotes here, the plan to take care of the needs of society, or not? How do we feel about super rich folks or moderately rich folks deciding the priorities for what parts of the society should get this boost in support? Well, my guest today is Robert Reich. He's a professor of political science and by courtesy of education at Stanford University, and he's an expert at philanthropy, the ethics of how a democracy runs and interacts with and depends on, in some cases, philanthropy. Rob, it seems that philanthropy is all good, but I wonder if it's a double-edged sword. Is it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the book I've written is meant in, classic philosophical style to submit to scrutiny what seems to be an obviously good thing, the inclination that people have to give their time, their money, their blood away to other people for a good purpose.
I apologize for my phone. I apologize to the Facebook Live folks. We'll probably have to edit this.
Why don't we ask that first question over? Sure.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. I'm turning off the phone. That is a first on the future of everything. My guest today is Rob Reich, who's a professor of political science and by courtesy of education at Stanford, and he's an expert in philosophy and the ethics of how democratic societies interact with and perhaps depend on philosophy. Now, Rob, it seems that philanthropy is all good. What's not to like? But I wonder, especially looking at some of the things that you've written, if it's actually much more of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, so as a philosopher, one of the things that philosophers do is to subject to scrutiny some things that seem obviously good and to try to make an all things considered judgment about exactly whether we should heap as much praise upon it as we often do. And the subject of my book is to do just that with respect to philanthropy. I came to the conclusion that there are, many ethical dimensions about philanthropy that render it something that can be quite problematic in democratic societies, and that instead of heaping, as we do today, automatic praise upon anyone who decides to give their money away for a philanthropic purpose, we ought to subject any philanthropic gift, especially one from a big donor, to some type of democratic criticism and examination. And I mean, maybe I can just give a simple example about this.
Yes, because there's a lot to unpack there.
There's a lot to unpack
I think most people say, it's my money,
Yeah.
I can do what I want with it. I think that's where many, at least Americans, would start.
All right, well, let me give you two examples, because these are examples about how I got into the book in the first place, why I bothered to research this. So you and I, we live here in the Bay Area. It's a pretty well-to-do part of the world. And I'd been on the faculty here a couple of years. I had my first kids. They got through preschool, and I got ready to pack them off to public school here in Palo Alto. And I don't know if you have kids or if you sent them to school in Palo Alto, but you're going to know exactly wherever I speak. Went to kindergarten. Day one, they came home with a bunch of great information about how fantastic the school district is, which included a letter from the school foundation in Palo Alto saying, dear Rob, your expected but voluntary contribution to the public school district this year is, $1,500 or $2,000 per kid. I nearly fell out of my chair as a parent thinking that I was expected to give to the public school district this money.
I thought this was what my taxes were for.
Totally. And then on top of that, insult, isn't this what tax dollars are meant to be for? Why are they asking me to pony up for this? The scholar in me had the intuition, well, gee, it seems just obvious that Palo Alto parents can afford to raise or donate much more money than can people in Oakland or East Palo Alto or wherever. So if we have a system that supplements school funding through charity, we're going to find out that charity actually ends up exacerbating the funding inequalities that already exist between schools. So Palo Alto will be able to raise something like $2,000 per kid, and East Palo Alto won't. And so this is an example of charity that actually worsens inequalities, that heaps greater advantage on those who are already speaking relatively advantaged. And the thing that I found out, didn't know when I did this, was that when you make that contribution to the Palo Alto school system, you're doing it to a 501c3 public charity, so you get a tax deduction for it.
Deductible.
So the rest of the country is subsidizing Palo Alto's privately subsidized public school system.
And I have experienced that. I'm at the far end of that. Everybody has graduated, and they're now sentient beings who are paying taxes. I'm proud to say, all three of my children. Yeah. But the targets for these foundations are incredibly compelling. We're going to increase the arts at the school. We're going to support athletics. We're going to do all these things that you want your kid to have exposure to, and yet it is being done in a way that is really not the plan, or it wasn't the plan when they set up the public schools.
Exactly. And
in fact, when we went to school, I don't know about you, I'm older than you. When I went to school, those kinds of things were part of the normal tax bill.
Were part of the ordinary thing. And I mean, it's true that California's public school funding has diminished over the course of the past couple decades. And it's an ordinary and noble, and it seems to me also correct view that anyone would have, that the arts and these various types of things that now seem supplementary, extracurricular, should be part of the ordinary public school funding. So I understand the impulse of parents to say, we want these things for our own children. The problem is, from my point of view, that the philanthropic solution to that problem, by doing it for your own kid's school or your own town school district, which of course props up your own property values, advantages your own children, does nothing about the root source of the problem, which exists in California and Sacramento in the public finance system. So when I talk to people who are involved in school auctions and school foundations, they'll often say, if it were only the case that Sacramento properly funded public schools, we wouldn't need to do all this. And then I want to say to them, so what are you doing about that part of the problem, other than in your local area helping out people just like you?
So and of course the example you gave just now is a great example and would extend in many ways to lots of other bigger philanthropic.
Absolutely.
It's basically the people have self-interest and self-interest, and they act on it, and it's my money, so I can do with it. So what are the real mechanisms that society has that are realistic and, I guess, precedented, although maybe it requires unprecedented, but you always start with precedented.
Exactly.
What are the precedented things that you could imagine to try to make changes on the edges or fundamental changes to
Right.
have things be better.
Excellent. Okay, so I mean, the first thing to say here is that the book I've written and the way I think about this as a political philosopher is to examine, just as you're now suggesting, the policy structure and the social norms that exist here. I'm not trying to offer moral advice to a donor or to say, dear Palo Alto resident, stop having the inclination to support the public school system.
See you at the soccer games.
Right, exactly. I have, parenthetically here, been disinvited from various weekend barbecues because of my views about this. That was a source of.
So you've taken some personal hit
I've taken
because
some
of
personal hit.
this academic
Yeah,
interest.
and I don't donate to the school auction or the my kids
I was going
are
to
still in the
ask
public
you
school.
that.
I still don't. I say when it's time for the parcel tax campaign, or if you want to troop off to Sacramento, sign me up. But not to the school auction. It doesn't make me a popular person when the PTA meeting happens. All right, so my focus is not on advice to people. Have whatever philanthropic inclination you want. My focus is on the public policies. Right. So let's take what could one do with the existing laws that are on the books. So one of the things I discovered in researching this book is that the United States is an outlier across all countries in how permissive we are in allowing virtually any organization to qualify as a 501c3 nonprofit. So basically, so long as you don't return, a dividend to your shareholders and you reinvest whatever revenue
which would be an
stream you
obvious
make,
profit.
which would be an obvious profit, then you can qualify as a nonprofit organization. But many other countries don't allow organizations without a clear charitable purpose. There's a legal definition of what a charitable purpose is to be a nonprofit. So one result would be you want to give money to your kid's public school, by all means do so. But it's like giving, it's like signing up for a gym membership or something. It's something that might be good for you. It might have even externalities that are good for society. Healthier people cost less socially than unhealthy people. But we don't treat it as a charitable act by policy. So one easy thing to do would be to say, you can even make this more fine-grained. If your kids or your town has a high proportion of kids who are poor, on free and reduced lunch is the easiest measure for that. Well, then maybe philanthropic donations should be tax subsidized to that place because it's assisting people who are genuinely needy.
And then society can, as a group, make that decision.
Correct.
We're going to encourage donations here.
Yep.
We're going to allow donations here, but we're not going to give special perks for
Right.
them.
But let me just point out one other thing. Another option would be actually to ban donations to public schools. And here's the thought, because I know that sounds un-American or like, what do you mean? It's my money. Let me do with it what I
Keep coming
want.
back to the it's my money.
Yeah, and that is an intuitive thought. But so here's the example I bring up in the book to try to dislodge that thought from people. So let's imagine instead of the school system, the neighborhood you live in Palo Alto or wherever, public funds for the police department have been going down. There's a budget crisis, and so there's just less police force out and about. And so as a result, there's an increase in crime in your neighborhood. And you think, well, we could go to the city council, we could talk to the mayor, we could try to get more money. And that's a hard thing. Who knows if it's going to be successful? How about this idea? Let's get the people together from our block and we'll donate a bunch of money to the police department. And we'll tell the police department we want to provide you this charitable assistance to hire an additional police officer whose beat will be our street. This is good. It's just additional money. Maybe we'll take a tax deduction for it on top of it because it's charitable. We're providing security for the neighborhood, but it's tied to our block.
Right.
The law does actually require not merely can't you take a tax deduction for that. The police department will send your contribution back. You are not permitted to direct the public service of security through the police for your own local benefit.
So could you give, on that example, you could give an unrestricted gift to the police?
Right. It depends on whether the city council would say you can give an unrestricted gift to the city. You might not even be able to give it just to the police. You could do it for,
and ask the city to do what they think is best.
Correct. Let the city council decide how to do it.
This is The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Rob Reich about philanthropy and why it's more complicated than it looks. Okay, so now so we can manipulate tax policy in order to is that the main lever, or have you identified other precedented, this is my new phrase, but other precedented levers that might manipulate?
Yeah, good. Well, there's a couple other things that I think are really obvious once you begin to just get into a little bit of the details of how philanthropic policy works. So there are 501c3 nonprofits. We could manipulate or change how it is we define what those
Who we
are.
even allow
Who we
to
even
be.
allow in. And then the other part of philanthropy, the one that's obvious as well, you mentioned this at the beginning with Rockefellers, is big philanthropy. And so we have a policy structure that allows the creation of things called foundations. Private foundations, family foundations, community foundations, these kinds of things. These are creations of the law. And they're actually not that old. They're about 100 years old. They were created in the time of John D. Rockefeller. He was the one
needed it.
who created the template for it. And among the strange thing about the law that allows foundations to exist is the idea that they are perpetual. So the default legal arrangement for a philanthropic entity is that it exists forever, and the governance structure is meant to ensure that it exists forever, which is to say, in philosophical provocation here, that we give rich people the permission to create a private entity to have some public benefit that will outlive the initial donor, which is to say the dead hand of the donor reaches out of the grave to strangle the preferences of all future generations.
That would be one way to put it.
Why is perpetuity a good idea? What made us think that allowing philanthropic projects to exist forever should be the default arrangement? So that's like another example there.
And you do hear about stories of foundations who, because of a good economy, their endowment has bloated to unbelievable sizes, and their mission is actually somewhat limited, and then therefore they have to do crazy things to spend the money.
Yes, exactly. I mean, here at Stanford, this is a classic example of when you have a narrow purpose and it's designed to exist forever, it can turn out to be a problem over the course of time. So, somewhere in the first couple decades after Stanford was created, I think 1880s or so is when the university was created by the philanthropist Leland and Jane Stanford. So some donor gave money to the university to support an undergraduate student and their cost of education, but only for students who arrived at the university via stagecoach. That was the restriction put on the gift. And of course,
example.
It wasn't so long thereafter that there were no students who arrived at the university on stagecoach. So Stanford had to go to court, as I understand it, to basically rewrite
Right, because rewriting is a big deal.
It's a big deal.
You got the money, and it was a legally executed document, and
it's
it
a contract.
said Stagecoach.
That's right.
So if you don't use it for Stagecoach, you're in violation of the terms of that endowment.
That's right. Right, exactly.
And so you got to go to and I know from working in fundraising for Stanford and educational purposes, the development folks are very careful about the promises they allow to be put in writing.
These
for that
days,
reason.
they're much savvier about that. That's right.
And it's very hard for those of us who are trying to raise money for our research or for our teaching activities to be in a 100, 300-year time frame.
Of course.
Like, I can't really predict what I'm going to be doing in 5 years.
Which is why it's a bad idea in policy to tell a donor, you think you're really sharp, you think you've got some great philanthropic ideas or causes to support, let's let you, through policy, decide the future for all generations to come.
So do we know enough about human psychology to know if making these changes would just torpedo philanthropy?
Good.
That's the worry.
That's a good question. And I mean, here, let's think about the academic division of labor. I'm a philosopher. I'm trying to offer a framework for assessing and examining philanthropy. And the question about whether if we make a policy change, what effect it'll have on actual, giving patterns, that's an empirical question. And I want to know the answer to that, but I haven't tried to provide that answer. But I can give you some intuitions I have that I think will maybe dislodge some conventional or instinctive thoughts that, oh my gosh, take the tax deduction away and no one's going to give any more money. And I mean, first of all, Tocqueville came to the United States in the 1830s and 1840s, the Frenchman who toured in America, who coined this classic phrase that America is a nation of joiners. It's people who get together and do things for themselves that in other places of the world government is expected to do. This is what was supposed to make America special. And in the 1830s and 1840s, this behavior that Tocqueville saw was not prompted by tax incentives. The tax deduction didn't exist until 1920. Rockefeller, Carnegie, all the people you mentioned at the top created those foundations without any tax benefit whatsoever because they thought it was a good thing to do, presumably. So the first thing to observe is that tax-deductible philanthropy is about 100 years old, and philanthropy in virtually every society has existed without it.
This is The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. More with Rob Reich about philanthropy, ethics, and its interaction with democracy next on SiriusXM Insight 121.
From the campus of Stanford University.
People are worried about data. They're worried about their privacy and their security. They should be. We need secure systems.
This is the future of everything.
But we can't have a system that closes that data off. It is too rich of a source of inspiration, innovation, and discovery for new things in medicine.
With your host, Russ Altman.
Welcome back to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Rob Reich about democracy and philanthropy. So at the end of the last segment, we were talking about what makes people give. And in fact, people like some of the big donors of the early 20th century did this not because of tax breaks or perhaps pedestrian concerns, but because they thought it was the right thing to do.
Exactly.
So talk to me about what is known about the psychology of giving.
Absolutely.
You know, there's also been these movements recently of the super rich, especially from the IT world, making these guarantees of spending down their wealth before their death.
Right.
What is known about that, and how does that inform your work?
Good. Well, so if you go back in 100 years or so to this first generation of big donors like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, Andrew Carnegie wrote this treatise, a kind of manifesto that was meant to describe publicly why it is that rich people should give their money away or give it back to society. And he claimed that it was basically a social obligation, that if you got rich on the back of the social infrastructure of the place where you made money, you had to return some of that enormous wealth to the society that permitted you the wealth in the first place, or it facilitated the wealth in the first place. So the line that Carnegie gives you is, the person who dies rich dies disgraced. Ooh. You're not supposed to just give your money to your own kids in inheritance. You're not supposed to just hoard it forever for some philanthropic purpose. Get rid of it in your lifetime. And the tech donors that you're talking about now, I think, take some inspiration from that. But leave aside the big donors. Another interesting question is, well, what makes the ordinary donor like you or me tick? And there, the psychological or empirical evidence about giving is pretty interesting. Basically, people often give, the simple way to put it is with their heart, not with their head. They give to things that they're passionate about, and they tend to give to things when someone they know asks them to give to something. So that can mean, your friend is running in the cancer half marathon, and you don't think to yourself, well, let me investigate the charitable cause that I'm supporting. Right. Is it really a good organization? You're doing it because your friend asked you to do it. Right. Let's be honest. This is why Stanford University, which is one of the most extraordinary places for raising money, philanthropic money, hires a bunch of undergrads or other people to call alumni and to say, hey, I'm here as a sophomore at Stanford University. I'm like you.
I've gotten those calls.
How do you think?
It's very hard to be rude to those young kids.
Stanford knows the psychology of giving. Whereas by contrast, if you just got a letter in the mail from another college that said, here's this extraordinary giving opportunity, let me give you the evidence about how successful a gift could be, you're more likely to give to something with your heart rather than your head. Now, for a philosopher, for many social scientists, that's a problem. You don't want passion to drive everything. You want people to actually get involved with analyzing whether the giving thing is worthwhile or not. Give to something that's a good cause. Give to something that's an effective cause. And that's where a lot of the academic work these days is in order to try to encourage better, more strategic, more effective giving.
And then, of course, that would have to be informed by our whatever understanding we have of human psychology.
Absolutely.
So you can make it palatable and you can make it work.
Absolutely.
But with exposure, people can then change behavior.
That's the hope.
Okay, so I wanted to move to the idea of I don't know if this is a term in your field, but I'm thinking of comparative philanthropy.
Yeah.
So you made a mention that United States was in some ways special.
Yeah, an outlier there.
And so what do we learn from looking at other places in the world about philanthropy? I think you mentioned it in the context of different laws for becoming a nonprofit.
That's right.
And I assume that there are also different cultural expectations about giving. They used to have tithing to the church. 10% of your income goes right to the church.
Yes.
I don't know a ton of people who are doing that these days. So what can we learn from a comparative look around the world?
Yeah.
And what does it tell about how democracies can and should run?
Good. There's lots to say here, but let me focus on just one issue, which is about how other countries tend to treat people of extraordinary wealth and their ambition to create a foundation and to give money away. So in the United States, we tend to celebrate this. The Carnegies and Rockefellers are the earlier example of it. In these days, it's the Zuckerbergs, the Gateses of the world as well. So, one way to think about this is the way I pose this in the book with respect to democratic societies, is that what big philanthropy amounts to, and I mean this just as a description, is the standing invitation of wealthy people to create an entity that is basically unaccountable, not especially transparent. One thing I learned in researching this book is that 90% of foundations don't have a website. so that if you wanted to apply for a grant to them, you wouldn't even be able to know it existed. All right. It's unaccountable. It's non-transparent. It's donor-directed. It's by default perpetual, and it's lavishly tax-advantaged. Or to put it simply, big philanthropy is...
I can see how the foundation guys would just love you.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's a tough audience sometimes. Big philanthropy is an exercise of power. And, the starting point for me is that wherever power exists in a democratic society, it deserves scrutiny, not gratitude. Right. So let's take the Gates Foundation, for example. I happen to think that a lot of what the Gates Foundation does amounts to the production of good things in the world. So roughly speaking, I agree with a good part of what the Gates Foundation's philanthropic priorities are. But at the same time, the structure which allows Gates to do that also allows foundations to exist who have horrible priorities and look like a waste of philanthropic money and taxpayer dollars to the Senate.
Or even nefarious purposes.
Right. The power that exists is creating problems. But stick with Gates. So, in France, there's this French economist, Thomas Piketty, who wrote this book a couple of years ago, got a lot of attention, Capital in the 21st Century. And he talks about the Gates Foundation as a way of avoiding taxation, because it's a way to diminish your taxes. And then he says, Gates sets up this foundation, and then because it's so large and because he has so much power, global health, American education policy, he basically shows up on the world stage as if he's a head of state. He shows up at all the meetings along with people who are the presidents. Like, who's the Gates Foundation's constituency? How can we unelect that guy if we don't like what he's doing? And the answer is you can't. He's there for as long as he wishes to be with no accountability. His board, the Gates Foundation, is Bill Gates, Melinda Gates, Warren Buffett, and I believe Bill Gates' father. You don't like what the Gates Foundation is doing, you can't unelect him. There's nobody that puts the Gates Foundation out of business.
Your only choice was to not buy Microsoft Windows
and that
25 years ago.
And we missed that window. Yes, that's here. That's already
That was
passed.
your purchase decision that basically enabled him.
Or you could say that a potential recipient could refuse a philanthropic gift, which is, of course, legally permissible. But given the balance of power, we shouldn't expect to see that happen routinely.
Okay. This is The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Rob Reich about philanthropy and its interaction with democracy and power. So how does the future look?
Yeah.
This is the future of everything. Do we need to clamp down in some ways? Is that ever going to happen? Do we have the political will for that? With the increasing difference in wealth distribution between the richest, this becomes an incredibly pertinent issue because there will be more people pondering this.
Yeah.
What's the outlook?
Excellent. So, in general, I think the outlook in the near term is that in an era of extraordinary inequality, there's going to be greater scrutiny and examination of what big philanthropists do.
Are there signs of this happening?
I think there's some beginning signs of that. Here I want to ask you about this because one of the things we've seen is the replacement of public funding of basic science with private or philanthropic funding of basic science. So we get lots of big philanthropists who get interested in basic scientific research. Now, in the broad scope of things, that's a relatively few people, but some extraordinarily wealthy people are giving to science. And one worry, and I want to ask you this question, this is more your area than my area because I'm not asking for money for basic science stuff. Well, you have to go find the donor who's already basically in sync with you, or you have to harness yourself to the existing interests of the donor. So is private funding of science tilting the direction of scientific research toward the idiosyncratic whimsies of rich people?
Right. So this is something I know a little bit about. And what I can say is the best donors do a ton of homework and tend to hit upon problems that have a lot of good features. So they tend to ask, what are things that are important that are not funded by federal agencies?
Right.
If the federal agencies are funding them, why would I want to give money?
Right.
So that's reasonable.
Yep.
They get, again, in the best cases, they get a council of advisors who give them advice about where there's great need. And in the best cases, they then put in large amounts of money in things that are generally not being funded.
Right.
Having said that, the quality of that process can be variable.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, and this goes back to something you said earlier, they usually make a very long-term commitment to a problem which, if they actually solve it, might lead to these problems of a huge endowment.
Right.
So they are now rethinking how to set up these foundations so that if they're actually successful in eliminating disease X, that they can turn the resources to disease Y. And I don't think we've seen a lot of
that yet.
Rejiggering of mission because of success.
Interesting. Good. So, in my book is not only a critique. There's a constructive, forward-looking framework for thinking about the role that philanthropy should play to support democratic ideals rather than undermine them. And you hit upon one of the versions of the constructive part, which is that philanthropy is distinctively able to take these long time horizon, risky investments in things like basic science. So you said the best donors engage in this sort of orientation, which is to say there's probably a whole bunch who aren't that great. And what levers are there available to nudge the ones who aren't the best donors into that better category?
Absolutely. And that's a problem because the ones who are the best and have the most resources have the most at stake. They do their homework.
Yep.
You have this middle tier where they're still busy.
Yep.
They still have to worry about life.
Right.
And you made this point is that they might still be going on emotions.
Yes.
Mom died of this terrible disease.
Right.
I want to put all my resources into this terrible disease. And it's very hard to say, have you thought about these other terrible diseases that affect many more people?
Exactly.
And I don't want to be the one to have that conversation with a donor whose mother just died
of
a disease. Before we leave, you've mentioned the book several times. Can you give us the title?
Yeah, the title is Just Giving, Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better.
Great. Thank you for listening to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. If you missed any of this episode, listen anytime on demand with the SiriusXM app.